before we start talking to the panel here, I just wanted to probably open the room and ask anybody who may want to raise their hands and tell us about what do you think design is? Like a short definition of what do you think design is? Anyone in the room? Anyone, 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 anyone? No one? If there's no one, then, okay, there's a hand here. Could you please get a mic? Over here in the front row.
A creative solution.
A creative solution, okay. Are there any other suggestions? At the back there, please.
I think it's you're able to embed in whatever you do.
Okay, all right, lovely. And can I turn this question on this panel now, starting with Bruce?
Oh, good. Design. I think it's a marriage of the aesthetic and the practical. And sometimes it's more in one direction than the other. And certainly in my medium and the profession I work in is that sometimes it becomes metaphorical as well. What is the deeper meaning and, you know, what story we can convey. But we'll come on to that.
Surely. Tarini?
For me, design is making the everyday better with a creative solution.
Great.
I think design is about how people interact with the world and each other, and the ways in which kind of materials can aid us to have better interactions with people.
Thank you.
I think design is identity. It's continuum, it's culture, it's our expression of who we are, our point of view, where we stand in the world. It's what connects us to each other, as you said, but it's also what grounds us and roots us, and it's how we tell our own stories.
Beautiful. I'm so glad nobody said product. Thank you. Okay, so since we've established that, the very intention of this panel is to expand that definition and understanding and go beyond the aesthetics and the physical. Let's start with the border conversation. You know, these days, especially globally and in India and other places, we talk a lot about boundaries and borders and hence transcending boundaries and, you know, dropping or breaking barriers and borders and things like that. I mean, while we know that it's us or the people who are at least in those positions of power who create borders and boundaries all the time, whether they are disciplinary, geographical, social, cultural, and all other kinds of sort of divisive boundaries. So the fact is that if design itself, if we believe that design itself has the potential to create porosity and to bring down those borders and to create connections, how do you do that through the lens of your own practice? Because your practices are so different, and I'm sure it'll offer a completely new way of seeing how you do that. Could we start with you, Pavitra?
Sure. Nothing like being put on the spot. I mean, I think for me, the question that I grapple with all the time and without intellectualizing it too much is this idea of relevance. I actually prefer the Hindi word, which is ahmiyat. There isn't a real translation into English, but really ahmiyat means relevance in design, not only in terms of like Tarini said, which is you know, how you design something or what meaning it brings. But I think in my own practice, what I'm constantly exploring is this idea of essentialism. You know, how do you create a relevance that is a marker of time, a moment, and that's about boundary or a border, right? The time in which we live or how we express ourselves in this moment. But how can you also be part of a much longer continuum where you bring the relevance of stories, of syntax, of dialogues that have existed, but that you constantly re-examine them in the modern idiom. I'm sure you're far more familiar than I am with, you know, some of the conversations around objects, you know, the colonial gaze, reclaiming parts of identity through design and through our structural practices. But I think all of that stems from this idea of rootedness, you know, having a sense of what the borders or the boundaries are to this context, this moment, but at the same time exploring how you can, you know, transcend all of those, and you find the commonality that exists. So I think for me, I do that through color, I do that through motifs, I do that through historical ideas and bringing them together. So for me, the fact that I work with product, or I work with a home, or I work with a space, that's not so relevant, because I feel tomorrow I may want to write, or I may want to express it in some other way. So I think the expression of design is quite fluid, but I think that point of time, point of view, understanding the border, but also appreciating the porosity of it. I think that's what I'm constantly exploring. One never ever masters anything, but that's the attempt.
Yeah, but I would just want to dig a little bit deeper into that, because what you said is really interesting and important. And you've had a really interesting and a few decade-long practice now.
Many decade-long.
Could you share like an anecdote about how you look back and see that shift having happened within your own work? There was something that you worked with 20 years ago in a different way, and today you look at it completely differently.
Wow, what a great question. For those of you who may not be aware, I'm an untrained designer, and I'm actually a student of politics and art history. And I kind of stumbled into design when I met Anita Lal, now about 26, 27 years ago, and we set up a little thing called Good Earth, which then took on a life of its own. And it's crazy that when you ask me that, because I think when I designed for Good Earth, I was very rooted in this idea of expressing an Indian aesthetic that was a direct rebellion of an aesthetic that existed at the time that we built the brand, right? These sort of bland, beige interiors, and this idea that that was what style was. So really, when one was designing in opposition to something, as a voice of rebellion. And I think that's what Anita, she used to always say, pink is the navy blue of India, like Diana Vreeland said it. How do we make that, how do we understand that color is luxury in India, and how do we not go away from that? And I think where that dialogue has moved so much now is not so much about that specificity of that response or the opposition to something, but for example, in the work that I do with Sabyasachi, with wallpapers and fabrics and the collections we work on, the dialogue and the discussion is never about what we're in opposition to. It's about how we express ourselves in this century. How do we take Indian design and Indian ideas and the concept of luxury that is so deeply essential in how we live our lives. And you'll see it across rural India and royal India and old India and new India, right? For us, luxury is very essential. So I think the design now is less about a response to something or a rebellion to something, and much more about trying to express in a holistic way this continuum, where we are, what are the ideas, and what is Indian, what is, why is it that there's no such thing as not Indian also, So I think that's how it's
Right.
changed,
Right.
yeah.
And that actually takes me to you, Meneesha, because you are the senior curator of contemporary at V&A. And the word contemporary itself is really interesting, because when you think of contemporaneity versus contemporary, and what was contemporary earlier and it's not now, it still sits within this finite idea of time. So could you, and at V&A there is all kinds of objects and things and performances, and what you do with the Friday Lates, which is again more performative and community in a sense. How do you respond to this idea of shifting the very understanding of design or its meaning with time? Because you've probably seen it chronicled within the museum, but your work is to create that public engagement and come up with newer understandings of that. Do you want to say something about this?
Yeah, it's really, we don't actually use the word design that much at all, even though what we're doing through the program and what we're curating is kind of rooted in design, because it's kind of an arbitrary word. And actually, the V&A often does, it has an audiences team, and this goes out to the general public, not design literate people, and the word design actually puts them off, strangely. We asked them what South Asian design means to them, and it puzzled people. They couldn't really, one, they were like, South Asia, where's that? But then also, design it's so expansive, it's almost meaningless. So what we do is really about experiences with people, bringing people into space. So for each Friday Late, it's an event that we do the last Friday of the month along a theme. We have around 6,000 people attend across 12 different activations across the museum, from DJs, performances, installations, workshops, talks, debates, discussions. And it's our kind of primary goal is to bring people to the museum who have never been before, so first-time visitors. And so we have to meet people where they are and what they're consuming and how they're consuming it. And I think this idea about borders is we live in a kind of borderless age in a way, because we're all connected via the internet, and that has a kind of paradoxical effect on identity and design, because you're part of a kind of global community with your specific interests, but then you are rooted in your identity and your the cultural kind of specificities and the things that make you you. So we try and focus on the fact that our core audience is London-based, and London is becoming more and more diverse. It's kind of almost that 50% non-white, which means that there are a multiplicity of different kind of cultural entities coming together that should be represented in a space like the V&A that historically, has been quite male white dominant. So my specific goal is to ensure that those communities are welcomed, and that there is something for them to kind of come back to again and again. It's not just a one-time experience.
And you said something there which is really important again. Where even is South Asia? This is a struggle, this is a conversation that we've had in India also for a while now, that what is the Indian design identity, in that sense? And with that question, I want to come to you, Tarini, and you know why. Because I discovered the work of Echo very recently, and I thought that was a really interesting way of answering this question. So do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so for me, we are living in 2025, and it is a global world, and borders are disappearing. And for me, it was really important to share my stories. And craft in India is story-led. Every vicinity, every small village, big village, we're a country of makers. And but for me, design is equally as important. So I said, why limit myself to just design that is local? Why not open it up and, sort of remove the borders and invite people to come and experience my culture, my stories, and tell those stories in a completely new lens, right? And that's why we collaborate with designers from across the world. And I've learned so much about my own country just by their interactions with the craft. And I think design is, I think it is borderless now in today's day and age. And like London, which is becoming, 50% non-white. And the world is changing rapidly, and I think we all have to keep up with that and be more collaborative.
But could you share something about when the collections that you've taken out recently of the collectible objects at Echo, where you invite an international designer to work with the craftsman in India? There is a lot to straddle there in terms of, establishing the right kind of balance and respect. But you're also putting two sort of entities together who probably know nothing about each other. So how does that kind of then create something which both the entities are happy with? How does design intervene in creating that respectful collaboration there? How does that happen?
So for me, Echo means I make equal to, and for me it was really important for the craft to be equal to the designer and not one above the other. So, and honestly, they speak with their eyes and their hands because it's design. So whenever any of our designers come to India, they actually don't even come to Bombay. They go straight to the craft and they spend 3 weeks to 6 weeks living with them. eating with them, learning, and they've learned so much, and the craftsmen have learned so much, and it's a true collaborative effort where they take ideas from them and vice versa. It's not that this is the way it is and has to be, there's no direction here. It's about collaboration.
Right. Bruce? So I'm actually really interested personally, as well as I think it'll be valuable for the room, to think about when you are, as a theater director, when you're directing, all these different performative narratives within a built space, and you're creating sets for them. There are so many ways in which you tell these stories, not just the actors or the performers on stage, but the way the lighting happens, the way the space is designed, the set is designed. Are you ever consciously thinking about design? What are you thinking about when you're putting this all together?
Yes, all the time. And it all starts with the story. And I think that that's the thing as well. And I think that whatever object it is that we're talking about in design in all facets is that a thing is a thing until it has a story and and that there are certain things that we will attach a truth and an authenticity to that then makes it more valuable in that sense, whether that is from a monetary sense of it or whether that is from an ideological sense of it, is that value is a thing that we all have and that we all ascribe to things depending on how truthful and authentic they are. Certainly for me it is. And a lot of the time in theatre is that we're creating props or we're creating costume or we're creating soundscapes, music, light, video projection now as well gets used an awful lot in what we do. And that what we're trying to do is find a version of the truth. And that truth is, it's where acting all starts from, is it starts from being able to inhabit someone else's truth and owning someone else's story in that sense for however long that the duration of the play is, that an audience is different from when they come into it than when they leave. And all of those different aspects, I mean, theatre borrows from every art form. And liberally, it borrows from every art form. And my process always starts with the script and the written word. And then it becomes about, well, which designers would it be most kind of like sort of suitable to work with in order to realize the production. And you have a sense of it. And I always know when I want to direct a script because I can see the ending of it in my head. It plays like a film for me. So then you start to build the team around about that, and it starts with discussions. They read the script and that they respond to it. And then it's mood boards. And it's usually just with the designer, the stage designer, the set designer, first of all, because then you build out from there. And then it becomes about, well, is this a very practical world? Is this a world that, that we're creating a kitchen and that we're going to cook in real time or whatever that might be? And how does that feed into the story? Because all of it is about the story. All of it is about the characters. How did the characters interact with this space? What are we trying to say? What do we want the looks to be? And gradually, as you add more and more people to the team, and they're all experts in what they do, and I trust that implicitly with them, because if I can tell a designer how to design something, I have the wrong designer. If I have a lighting person and I'm telling them where to point a light, I have the wrong lighting person. It's all about adding to that team and constantly collaborating in order to be able to achieve a thing that you don't necessarily know entirely what it is at the beginning of the process, but by the end of it, you do. And that's evolving all the way through the rehearsal process, into previews, into the show actually happening. So it's a constant sense of collaboration, but it's all kind of governed by an instinct and an experience which is there.
But what I'm keen to hear about is, has there ever been like a reverse loop? Because within your work, like you said, in theater and in cinema, in films, it kind of, it's made of all different kinds of creative disciplines, some of which you named. Has it ever happened that one of these practitioners that you were working with impacted a change in the script? Was there ever a reverse loop?
All the time, but it really is that the way that I view it is that the writer is the creative artist in the room, and everyone else is an interpretive artist. So the writer is the person who sits down and imagines what this world is, who these characters are. And I think that at times, when you get radical reimaginings of things, it's usually because, say that there's been an iconic version of a show, like I say, Phantom of the Opera, which has been redone, okay? That people will then start and they'll be like, okay, we want to give people a sense of this is a story that we're telling, but what if it's not that? What happens is we just completely decide that this is a brand new piece. I worked with a director a few years ago. I'll name drop a bit, but Sam Mendes always said this, is that treat every new play as if it's Shakespeare and treat every Shakespeare as if it's a new play, which I think is a really refreshing kind of take on writing and how fresh a 400-year-old play can be because of the way that you approach it. And so I think that with that, it's just that it's great when people say is that there are rules, we're going to know what those rules are, but then we can choose liberally how we break those rules with respect. But that, how do we reimagine this? How do we do something different? And what you were saying about space as well, all the time we have to react to spaces, and particularly in the phase of my career that's happened in India is that you will turn up and that the spaces will be radically different, sometimes from what you've been told that they're going to be. And you've got to make it work. Jugaad was the first word that I learned. And you've got to make it work because you have an audience that's coming at a certain time and they expect to be told a story and they expect it to be good.
It's interesting, if I could just add to what Bruce was saying when he was talking about, the 400th version of staging something. This is something that culturally for us we're so attuned to. The Ramayana, for example, there are 200 known versions of the Ramayana. There's the Valmiki Ramayana, there's the Ranganatha Ramayana. There's a version of the Ramayana in Orissa, which is called Ravan Charita, where Ravan is the hero of the Ramayana and the story centers around him. So I think the richness of oral cultures is that the layering that happens, there is no linear way. I remember seeing a play in London years ago, it was called, I think, A Drowning Man. And where the play happens in different spaces.
Punch Drunk, yeah, Punch Drunk is the name of the company.
Is that what it's called? Where you wander from, the audience wanders from one room to the other. So the play continues to happen, but the audience isn't stationary. So everyone who's seen that sees a very different version of what it is, because depending on when you chose to leave or when you chose to enter or the thread that you chose to follow. And I think that's a great metaphor for how we experience design. And I'm so glad you talked about the dismantling of that word. Because the fact is that for us, design is craft, it's history, it's storytelling, it's culture, it's discipline, it's all of these things, and it's none of these things as well. So I think that a little bit of what we're all doing, I mean, all four of us, and everyone in this room, is that you're exploring that point of view and your window into all of these things.
And just to add to that, you mentioned there's no Hindi word for design, and so we're on.
I said the Hindi word for relevance.
Oh, sorry,
is
relevance,
ahmiyat.
yeah. But also there isn't.
Yeah, is there a Hindi word for design? Does anybody know? Is there a Hindi word for design?
There's no concept. Concept doesn't exist.
Well, my point was going to be around the fact that we're talking about design through a Western lens, because the word is Eurocentric. And so maybe we need kind of an expansion of the kind of words around design to really expand how we can talk around the subject and also bring people in. I think it's something that is a primary concern of what I do is really kind of expanding audiences, working for a colonial institution like the V&A that has, such deep roots and almost like damage in India in particular and across South Asia, that actually there is this sort of repair work that an institution like the V&A needs to do around, we were talking about reparation earlier, but also ensuring that we're telling people's stories accurately and really kind of being honest and truthful about the genesis of like the seed of an idea and where that's coming from, and it not always being rooted in Eurocentric Western thinking.
And also allowing people to tell their own stories.
Exactly.
But that's actually a very interesting question here for the room. If there are designers in the room or people who work with what we call design in English, how do you talk about this if you don't use the word design? How do you communicate with your teams, with the craftsmen or people that you work with? Is there someone who wants to share something about that? Yeah, over there.
So I'm a product designer myself. So sometimes it's about, so when we are working in tier 2, tier 3 cities, we can't directly say that, design, like you said, is challenging. So a lot of the time it is about the experience and form and function kind of a thing, which goes into translation like, ye aapko utility mein aayega, ya, that kind of a thing. So yeah, right, like you guys are saying, there is no literal translation to design, but if I had to expand the word vocabulary, and not just in English, but also in Hindi, I think that those would be the terms. Because form follows function kind of thing, we have taken that analogy at the studio and kind of expanded it over there.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Over here.
Design, I think, does not have a literal translation. Design does not have a literal translation. But creation does. Rachna. आप दिमाग में किसी चीज़ की रचना कर रहे हैं, you're creating something, and I think when talking to the workers and the artists who are working on some product, you may not use the same term as design, but you explain them by saying इसकी बनावट हम ऐसे करेंगे. So yeah, you're right. There's no term for design, but rachna, I guess.
Yeah. Thank you, creation.
Comes
yes.
close to it.
Yeah, thank you. That takes me to the next part of our not questioning, discussion. So, I mean, we again, identity and all the debates and discourse about identity are neither confined to a sort of circle or discipline or to a room. It's happening everywhere. But I actually read something really interesting, Pavitra, on your website when I was doing a little bit of research. It's a quote by a Greek philosopher.
I'm just so happy someone goes to my website.
It's a really beautiful website, by the way. Yeah, people should go there. So it's a Greek philosopher who you've quoted there that says, "No man ever steps into the same river twice, for it's not the same river and he's not the same man." So I feel like that's such a beautiful way of also talking about how the identity debate or the identity struggle at some level is also futile. While it's really necessary in this moment, especially for people who've struggled to probably have an identity or kind of put their identities out there, own their voices, make space for themselves. A really beautiful discussion a few of us at least witnessed just before this one in the other room. But on the other hand, when you really deeply think about it, that we are probably all on a spectrum of some kind. Whether it is to do with our gender, it is to do with our race, whether it is to do with our ability, physiology, our sort of neurodivergence, whatever. I feel like, personal opinion, that everybody is on a spectrum of some kind. And the very reason why the world is divided into or designed into a classification system was so that people can be governed more easily. So whether you are a certain caste, you're a class, you're a race, whatever you are, it's just for the sake of governance and to make that easy. But if the identity itself is fluid and we are all on a spectrum, I feel like that's such an interesting notion to take forward, because then you're almost creating like this big risotto khichdi of everyone that it becomes almost impossible to design or divide people in a sense. And I was just thinking through, again, maybe coming back to you, Bruce, because the work that you do, everybody engages with it, right? Everybody comes to see theater, no matter what they do, no matter, in their, they don't have to be professionals of a kind to engage with the work that you do. How do you, or do you ever think about when you're reimagining narratives, how do you think about retelling these stories in a new way in this time? Maybe the same play that you might have sort of done 15 years ago or 20 years ago versus if you were talking about reproducing something, doing a completely new way of doing something. How do these ideas of identity and what's current in this moment inform that change or the lens with which you relook at something that you had done before?
I think that personally as a director is that it comes from what do I think is interesting in that moment, and do I think that this story has relevance at this moment in time with in terms of the work? How do we make it the most interesting that can be? How do you make it accessible without dumbing it down? How do you make it as high quality as it can be? But also when you're curating, and that's quite a critical thing, is to be able to have the empathy and the openness to be able to appreciate somebody else's view on it, that they see the world in a different way, that story that comes from that part of the country or that from that group of people. We just had a festival here quite recently that we collaborated with the Mahindra Excellence in Theatre Awards on, and so we had plays from all over, and very different practice, very different methodology, very different types of story, different languages, different textile, everything that came into it. And that was something to embrace, because it's amazing to see how different people approach the same problem and come up with completely different results. And I think that when you're approaching a text as well, you will have massively different interpretations, 200-400 different versions of what is supposed to be the same story, but it's not. And it's all dependent on who it is that's there, what point in their life that they're at, to take your quote from the website a little bit further. It's all to do with time, where that person's at in their life, what they've maybe been exposed to, how many things that they have seen, and that then their imagination being put to that. Because our imaginations are unique to us, but that they are fueled by our experiences and the things that we gravitate towards, and that the more experiences that a person can have. I mean, I remember when I was auditioning for drama school, a long time ago now, but that someone told me, you need more life experience. And I was like, well, how am I going to get life experience if you don't let me into drama school? And I know what that means now, because traveling did that for me, and it just blew my mind completely, because it was all to do with experiencing something and giving yourself up to it. And it's not the same as tolerating, it's not the same as embracing, it's not the same as accepting. Yeah. And the more that you do that, then your world just opens up, because it's a big old world out there and there's lots of amazing people in it. Right. So, yeah. Right.
And do you want to say something about that?
No, I'm very conscious of that.
Yeah. I'm keeping an eye on that.
So I'm
but
definitely not speaking.
But we will all have a chance to kind of meet outside after this session and talk more. But Tarini, that brings me to you, because when I personally discovered the work that Echo is doing, and I saw some really cool pieces, and I was like, these look so refined, these are amazing, but these look so Indian. This was my first reaction to it before I discovered what it was all about. So my first reaction was that, oh, I'm so glad that somebody is putting design and Indian design on the global map. But then again, when I think about things like this whole identity struggle, end of the day, I feel like all of this, at some level, is futile, but also necessary. So when you were kind of embarking upon this project, did you think about, what was your drive? Did you think about you wanted to make a mark for Indian design as an identity on the global map? Was that something you wanted to do?
So for me, when I started the project, I started because when you go abroad and you see beautiful objects, a lot of it is made in India. But no one ever gives India any credit. No one gives our karigars any credit. No one talks about it. Everyone's shying away from it. It happens in fashion, it happens in design, it happens in almost every industry, right? Where we do a lot for the world. And it always used to bother me. And I was like, why can't we create a brand out of India which can tell the story in an authentic manner globally? And that's what we did.
That's not cheap. Because there are lots of stories out of India, and then people expect you to put a price tag on it. That's cheap. And I think what you've done, and bravo, I've known you for so long, and I really applaud that, is that you've put Indian craftsmanship and global design right up there with the best of collectible design in the world. And I think that's really the success.
Thank you. And it's just the beginning, because I think we have a long way to go, and I think there's a lot to achieve. But I think we can do it because we have the bare bones, and we have the talent and the creation. The rachna is here, right? So I think that's really, there's a long way to go, but at least it's a start.
Right, yeah. Could I open up the room again? If somebody wants to say something, share something, ask something, please do raise your hand. Yeah.
No, I just want to make an observation. It's an observation more than a question. Going back to the subject, we talked about identity. Today, with socio-political and geopolitical issues which we all face, what we need to ponder upon, can design design borders, or can borders design design? We have many things which borders put in. We also living in a virtual world where there is no borders. At the same time, the cultural rootedness, the context which we all come from different parts of the world, also design. So, as we say, does the land belong to us, or we belong to land? Design also does not belong to borders, and borders does not belong to design.
Thank you. Yeah. Does anybody want to say something about that? I mean, it's the truth that design designs. And we are not saying design. I'm forgetting totally the name of the scholar, the theorist who put out design designs, Anne Marie, I'm forgetting her surname. But just in 2 words, design, comma, designs, what she says is that everything that we designs us back. So every time that we are exercising our influence or our power to design something, whether physical or metaphysical or non-physical or whatever, imaginary, we have to be conscious of what we are going to design and put out there is going to design us back.
It's an iterative process, but I think something that we need to be conscious of in a society in a global age now where, climate change, we're seeing it across, in the news at the moment, the wildfires in Los Angeles, we also need to ask ourselves, what do we need to create in the world? Does the world need more things? And the things that we're creating, are they making life better for the majority, or are they being extractive for the minority? And can we adapt what we see around us rather than, extract stone from quarries and, oil from the ground? I think there's a huge responsibility that comes with being a creator or maker or designer, especially in the time that we live in.
But also same thing applies to the non-tangible, like data. That is being massively mined. And within
AI is responsible for a huge global consumption of energy.
Yeah, exactly. But also the very data that they're storing, who is it going to serve a purpose for? For the other corporations to, again, kind of use that data from influencing our elections to, our minds, to our beings, to everything. But since we just have less than a minute left, I do want to do a quick survey. So there is this age-old debate in the design world, which is form follows function or function follows form. But it's really interesting to be sitting in a time when the debate has gone beyond just these 2 options. So there are so many versions and iterations of form follows what. And I was just sharing backstage when we were talking that Anna Heringer, if some of you know her, she's a German, architect who works a lot in Ghana and in Bangladesh. She just released a book called Form Follows Love. And I was talking to Suchi Reddy just a week ago, whose installation, Chromacosm, is outside in the Pavilion Park as a special project. She said, form follows feeling. Could I quickly throw this open to you all? What do you think? What would be that dash, the fill in the gap, the dash there? Form follows what for you?
I think form follows intent.
Care.
Form follows intuition.
Possibility.
Wonderful. Anyone in the room wants to say something quickly? Chaos. Definitely, 100%. Okay, on that note, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your brilliance and sharing your wisdom with us. Thank you so much for being in the room, and I hope these conversations will continue. Just to kind of wrap up this panel, in the experimental theater itself, at 4:15, we are showing Soviet bus stops. That's a really beautiful film that shows the documentation of these really amazing, almost bizarre bus stops in the ex-Soviet regions. But we also have a very interesting epilogue attached to that, wherein we've invited artists Tukral and Tagra to respond to that film by sharing their work, which was documenting these tankis, the water tanks in Punjab. So please don't miss that here. There are other things happening in Little Theatre, in JBT, and finally in the evening we will have a closing talk for the festival at 6:30 p.m., wherein Hansal Mehta, the filmmaker, and Amit Gupta, who is STIR's founder and editor-in-chief, would be in conversation with Bakul. She's a design curator and art curator, And we will try to bring the whole festival to a close through a topic called Culture is Ordinary, because we really need to release culture from the clutches of what tries to make it disordinary. So thank you so much for being here.